session, Barbara Wesel.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I would like to introduce the last panel of this exciting and interesting 3 days to you. And we will be talking about maybe the core issue at many of the problems that we have considered in the last days. That is the lack of trust in politics, in the European Union, in the nation state, in a lot of different things. So let me first introduce maybe our panel to you. We have Professor Vivian N. Schmidt from Boston Purdue School, Boston University, right there. We have next to her, to my left here, Professor John Eric Fossum from the Arena Center of Oslo University. Welcome. We have next to Vivian, Goran Buldjovski, Open Society Initiative for Europe from Budapest. And we have at the far side of the panel, Daniel Milo from GLOBSEC Policy Institute, right here. So you're the only one who is at home here. Welcome to all of you. We have been watching an extraordinary piece of political theater during the last week, and it today comes to a provisional conclusion. We have seen the tiny region of Wallonia hold up for a whole week the EU-Canada trade deal. Today, finally, Justin Trudeau can come to Brussels, and it's just right now, exactly, that they are getting ready to sign the treaty. Wallonia decided last week that they could not possibly say yes to this. It had been 7 years in the making. There were, of course, consultation rounds and so on, the way the European Union operates and works. But at the very end, suddenly, the Wallonian government said, we're not contented with this. We don't like what you negotiated on our behalf. It's not good enough. Even though everybody had said, you know, this time, this really is the good contract. We really took all the European standards on board. This will protect the environment, it will protect the future of your agriculture, etc. But Wallonia just didn't believe in it. So they sat down for a week and held up the whole machinery in Brussels and just added like 2 or 3 pages to the already lavish annotation that are sticking to this agreement. So provisional, I said, because we probably haven't seen the end of it. A few court cases are sort of pending in this, and the whole process of ratification in all the member states and further regional parliaments might turn out to be laborious. However, there is no time for relaxation in Brussels today at all, because tomorrow the next boomerang flies around the corner. The Netherlands will, that's what we hear, withdraw agreement to the Ukraine deal. Reason for that is they held a referendum last winter, and with a small majority, and that's a particular problem of referenda in the Netherlands, people said, we don't trust this Ukraine deal. We're afraid that Ukrainians will come to the European Union very quickly, maybe next year, and we, the Dutch, will have to pay for them. It's such a corrupt country, they haven't reformed enough. We don't trust this, and they voted it down. So what we're seeing here is that, in a way, the European Union, if this carries on, stops functioning in a particular way. Treaties are negotiated, and then in the end, they can't be implemented because from all sides, citizens, regions, local governments, maybe even national governments come and say, we're not contented, we don't like this. So I would like to put the first question actually to to Vivian and ask you, what are we seeing here? Is this a particular development that was sort of like a fault of the European Union from birth? Is it something that has developed over the last time? What's your analysis of this?
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. I think we're seeing two different phenomena. They're both expressions of a problem for the EU, and that is that the more the EU has grown, the more it has undermined national democracy. And there's a real problem between what goes on at the EU level and the national level. It's something that I've called, at the EU level, it's policy without politics, and at the national level, it's politics without policy. As more and more decisions are removed to the EU level, at the national level, voters feel less and less in control. But given that, they're two very different phenomena. On the one hand, in Wallonia, it's really an expression of national, or let's say subnational, government saying, wait a minute, this has an impact on our citizens. Finally, we're going to find a way to have our say. And so that's a very interesting and important issue for national politicians, mainstream politicians. In fact, Paul Magnette is a scholar of democracy in the EU and has a very clear sense of these problems. That is his saying, this is what we need to make this democratically acceptable to our people, and a very different phenomenon going on in the Netherlands. And here we have to talk about the rise of the political extremes, the rise of populism, which is actually, I think, a very dangerous phenomenon in the EU, but of course not just the EU, as we know. But it's about, so I think the big question is, how do we explain this other phenomenon, whether we're talking about Geert Wilders or others? And I would say it's about politics, it's about ideas, it's an anti-politics, it's not just the economy, stupid. Yes, it's about left behinds, but it's also about identity politics. It's about the impact of globalization, not only in terms of issues of economics and the left behinds, but also identity. It's, as in the previous panel, it's about immigration, and the way in which immigration has already changed things for people over the past 30, 40 years. Changed not just the way in which they live, which is the economy, but also who they live with. And I think this has been problematic for certain parts of the population. For those people who feel left behind, there's resentment against immigrants. Wait, they're taking our jobs, even though these people would not take those jobs. And there's resentment, and there's also, of course, this big increasing inequality gap between those people, the haves and the have-nots. And since even before the crisis, especially at the time of the crisis, we saw the 1% versus the 99%, but more recently, subsequent to the crisis, it's the 20% who have prospered and the 80% who have not. And I think all of these are issues that get bound up together. And what you see is a rise of the extremes. And what happens with the extremes is they have a political discourse that seems to resonate. It gives easy solutions. It's a populist language in which they will say the unsayable, the politically incorrect things to say. And people say, we're liberated. We too can say these things. At the same time that the mainstream cannot. Some of the time. But I think one of the biggest dangers that we've seen in recent years is that as the extreme right makes, and it's particularly the extreme right, makes rather outrageous statements, we find the center right running after the extremes in order to try to get back their voters. Sarkozy is a good example of this. And unfortunately, we also see the center left running after the center right that's running after the extreme right. So that we see this sort of move toward a lot of the unsayable things being said. And of course, none of the problems being resolved. Because the more people move to the extreme right, the more they adopt the so-called easy solutions, the more this is a disaster to the EU. Because it's all more nationalist, more sovereignist, more identity politics, more we hate the other. It's all about us versus them. And that also means forget the EU.
Listening to you, Vivian, it reminds me of why the Brussels think tankers call the current state of the European Union not a crisis. That's not good enough. They call it a poly-crisis, which is something that comes from all sides at the same time and threatens to devour you. I would just like to mention a little thing that we, of course, encourage questions via the TATRA Summit app for those in the hall outside, and tweets from outside, using the hashtag GTS16. All right, John, from what corner of this poly monster that we have seen, that Vivian has so vividly sort of shown up for us, from which side do you think we can approach this? What is the angle that you would like to enter?
Well, first, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to attend this very, very interesting seminar. It's a real listening post to what's going on, and I feel really privileged to be a part of this. I guess in the American constitutional debate, there was a talk as to whether you need to develop democrats in order for political systems to function, or whether you can make a system that could also withstand devils. So we have limited abilities to program people to put it like this bluntly. So at least we have to focus on the institutions. So I will start my pitch by talking about institutions in this. So there are really two things I want to say, and both pertain to trust and legitimacy. One is the idea of governing effectiveness. And you can only, I think, stem some of the tide and some of the problems that are arising by having viable policy and political instruments. Politics and policy, to some extent, have to go together, as Vivian also was saying. Now, with the European Union, one of the problems I see is what I would call a competence delivery gap. Okay, that sounds a bit abstract, but what I mean is that more and more tasks are being assigned to the European Union. There are more and more expectations as to what the European Union is supposed to be doing. However, it's not actually been given the resources, because the further this spreads, the more this gets into types of redistributive issues, distributional questions, as we see with the crises. And the EU has regulatory instruments. It doesn't have those types of mechanisms that are necessary to deal with those problems. And therefore, there is the danger of an expectations performance gap on the part of the EU, because expectations have risen too much, and its ability to actually deliver on these tasks has not been adequately or developed in a commensurate manner. That has to do with political opposition, but it also has to do with the actual development of the European Union itself by being very much of a regulatory machine. That's also why the economic capacities of the European Union are so important. If the Union is supposed to be saddled with these tasks, and these are the things that people expect from it, you also would expect it to have commensurate resources. This is just a structural conundrum, and it is a political decision that has to be decided in terms of which assigned tasks the European Union really should be assigned. So I think people also have to be sober about this, what kind of expectations they saddle the European Union with, and also to be sanguine about what tasks this really should be undertaking. So that's the first aspect. The other thing is the real conundrum facing the European Union in also trying to deal with this, and that is, it's a triangular problem, I call it. One is the rise of populism and the people who don't trust experts. And democracies really rely on expertise as well to function properly, to solve problems. So the first is populists denigrating experts to what they in Denmark call taste judges. So you just hold the finger up in the air and say, yeah, this is what I want. Now, expertise is more than that. We know that. The problem is that in the European Union, experts are also being hived off into independent bodies. You see, for instance, Mario Draghi being saddled with very fundamental political tasks in a so-called expert body and not being accountable to anyone. And the third is the media, and partly the personalization and the tabloid media that are not actually helping to connect citizens to the type of system. So what we get is that representative government, parliaments and so on, are seeing a triple squeeze. They're squeezed along all these lines because their ability to communicate, to connect with citizens is diminished, and their ability to catch up with experts and leaders is also being challenged, and they are always running behind, trying to catch up. So they are in this type of squeeze. So there are institutional angles to this as well. Thank you.
Goran, I would like to ask you, listening to what John said now, do you think that citizens in Europe actually have a clear idea what they really can expect from the European Union and what they can expect from the national governments? Think about Brexit, for instance. People were having all sorts of expectations about inequality. Actually, the NHS, the British National Health System, played a big role in Brexit because people had the idea, being fostered by the pre-Brexit propaganda, that huge amounts of money could be saved on the European side, and then that would be poured also into the ailing National Health Service in Britain. So that had absolutely nothing to do with the European Union, but the expectation was somehow linked to Brussels. Do you think that really there is an idea of what is our own doing, like why doesn't Britain finance its own health services, and what's European doing, and who is responsible for that? And then also a little tie back to what Vivian said in the beginning. It's not only the economy stupid, is it? Question mark.
As someone who works with civil society, I have to say, civil society, government, media, they all failed in many ways to build citizens. We have in 21st century, we have very good consumer base. We have actually very literate consumers, but we have illiterate citizens. And I don't fool myself that all citizens will know all the details about the electoral systems and so on, but they're genuinely confused. They're genuinely confused because, usually at the domestic level, they were convinced in the parliamentary democracy, in actually electoral systems that brought a certain importance about the locality. Then they go at the European level, and then you have actually the majoritarian, and then they see that actually, oh, it's the absolute numbers that count. And I don't blame, for example, the British who support UKIP, that they feel, oh, great injustice has been done, because literally for the same number of votes that UKIP has, they have one member of the parliament, and the Scottish National Party has, I think, 54 or 56. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not in favor of changing the systems, but if I'm an average citizen who is relatively ill-informed, I will not understand that. And I have to say also the civil society there, on both sides of Europe, probably even three, I should say, West, East, and South, has failed in its task. It was busy with other tasks, in the more affluent places, in providing services. I believe in Eastern Europe, where I've worked quite a lot, with actually chasing the high-level goals, not looking at what people really suffer with. And to your question about what really people suffer with, to me the magic number is 10. It's not about the 10 commandments that the Hungarian State Secretary tried to defend on the earlier panel, but it's actually about the 10% increase in inequality in the OECD, which was really well documented with their last year's report. And if you get there, actually, it's a lot about identity politics, but a lot of communities have a real worries, and they cannot pay the bills, they cannot survive, and they're losers of the transition. And I think we have had inequality always. We have now basically a situation where the 10% have the 50% of the wealth in the OECD. 40% of population owns only 3% of the wealth, so that's the wealth. But a skeptic among us will say, wait a second, inequality is part of our civilization that has always been around. But let's not forget one thing. Democracy has basically brought us from the state of brutal force, where yes, it's unequal, but there is somebody who will murder you and you can't do much, or from divine intervention. It's God's will for you to be poor. Now, actually, we operate in systems where we have unprecedented level of scrutiny and transparency. And I think that's actually a good news. But couple that with the real inequality and the suffer what you have, actually you see a system of injustice. And I think that the combination of inequality with the sense of injustice actually brings people to feel that the government does not deliver for them. And they feel the government actually delivers for the elite. And that's why they have the protests. And one has to start unpacking. And unfortunately, politicians, both nationally and at European level, have have not started unpacking it, the problems of real people in real localities to the extent that they should have.
Unpacking the strands, all the different strands that have been mentioned here. On the national level, the rise of populism, the what you call, John, the triangular problems, the different pressures the governments are under. I mean, Brexit probably would not have happened, you mentioned the media, probably would not have happened unless a particular part of British media were in a particular ownership, I mean, to put it bluntly. Daniel, I would like to bring you in. Is it possible to sort of really undo this, untangle all these strands, and then deal with like one after the other, deal with all of them at the same time, educate citizens more, and at the same time, manage expectations, treat them better like you do in raising children, you know, say what you do and you know, do what you say. So is that doable at all, or where do you see the entrance to this tunnel?
I think we are in a situation of a firefighter who tries to put off a fire of, let's say, European house, while there is an arsonist pouring more petrol on the fire from the other side. And I think we just need to name it very openly that, you know, there are other external factors, external players who are very actively trying to undermine our, you know, European Union identity and trying to abuse the existing inefficiencies which there are in our societies. And I would certainly agree with what was said before by Vivian, that it's not only the economy, it's also the sense of alienation of the general public and this erosion of trust towards any elites, towards the experts, media, politicians. But as I said, these are the internal factors we definitely need to address. But then when we leave the external ones out of the whole equation, I don't think we would be successful. And well, unfortunately, until now, I don't see very little efforts in this direction. And let me, Barbara, maybe go back a bit to your first question regarding the potential rollback of the EU-Ukraine treaty. If that actually happens, well, that seems to be the case for the moment, you know, this would deal a huge blow to not only to Ukraine and to their prospects as a viable state, but you know, just remember that 2.5 years ago, there have been hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians fighting on the streets, you know, trying to make their way, or you know, fighting for their future in Europe. And if we as European Union, as European countries, you know, break this trust, and we roll back on this promise to give them, you know, maybe after a certain period, after they do the necessary reforms. But if we do break this trust, you know, what kind of message do we send to other, you know, EU neighboring countries, to you know, those countries who aspire to become members of our elite club and to also embrace our values? I think this is also a very dangerous message we might be sending as a Europe.
And everybody in Brussels is extremely afraid of that. I mean, that is, of course, really the issue of the day. Vivian, how can this be overcome? I mean, we're looking at a European Union that becomes, in a way, more and more incapacitated. I mean, I've just, you know, mentioned those two examples of they would want to act and then they find it very difficult, like with Canada, or they find it maybe totally impossible, like with Ukraine now. And they're caught sort of within their own web, the own web of maybe lack of legitimacy, lack of democratic openness, lack of participation, many things that have been built up over years. Now, is there a way out of this? I mean, Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister who opened this meeting here, has been mentioned many times, and of course what will stay from him is really that he said, I spend most of my time repairing the European house, not building it, so heavy repair works on the roof, on the walls, on the windows, on the doors, I mean, everywhere. Vivian, so where and what?
Okay. We need both more Europe and less Europe at the same time. I think we need more Europe, certainly in areas like asylum, security, and the rest. And then Eurozone, we need both more and less at the same time. I think we need to, before I continue with that, I want to go back and revisit what has happened over the past 30, 40 years. And it's actually, is the economy stupid? As well as all of the other things. And if we look at what's happened with globalization and neoliberal policies, what I would say is we've gone too far. Danny Roderick talks about hyperglobalization being a danger to both democracy and sovereignty, and he says you can only have 2 out of the 3. Well, I would argue that in the Eurozone, we've had hyper-Europeanization, which means actually you can only have 1 of the 3, meaning hyper-Europeanization destroys both democracy and sovereignty. That's a serious problem. And so my answer to the Eurozone crisis is actually continued coordination at the EU level, but renationalization of responsibility for fiscal policy. You've got to give back to the national level, to national governments, to parties, the possibility to debate what kinds of economic policies they want and actually make those policies. Otherwise, part of the reason you've got the rise of the populists is it really is politics without policy. There's no responsibility in its politics. It doesn't matter if you're on the left or the right. It's the same policy that appear to be coming down from Brussels, or should we say, dare I say, Germany. Because there's another aspect to this, and that has to do with the rules, the governing by rules and ruling by numbers. And however flexible they are becoming, that actually is also a problem in terms of legitimacy. Because when you say, oh, we're following the rules, everyone's following the rules, strict following the rules, but you then give derogations to the rules and create more flexibility necessary to have good performance. At the same time, what you're doing is you're making the Germans feel deceived. They're lying. They're not following the rules. And for Southern Europeans, they're feeling oppressed. We're forced to follow these rules, even when they're accommodated. So we have a serious crisis of legitimacy with these kinds of rules that Prodi, I think was mentioned yesterday, said are stupid. In fact, they're not just stupid, they're highly destructive, not just to economics, but also to legitimacy and to political legitimacy. So that what I would argue is you decentralize policy at the same time that you coordinate. Yes, you need rules, but you don't need these kinds of rigid rules.
Okay, you certainly make Matteo Renzi happy, that's for sure.
You also need redistribution. You need a whole range of mechanisms at the EU level that actually make it possible for the left behinds to no longer be left behind. There needs massive investment in education and infrastructure and training, a whole range of things that would actually help lift people up in Southern Europe. And for those in Northern Europe who say, wait a minute, who's paying for this? You're paying for it anyway. It becomes a question of how you pay for it. And ultimately, the future is one of interdependence in the EU. This is true for the Eurozone, where I'm saying less integration in some areas, but also more at the same time. But asylum policy, in terms of refugees, for example, what you probably would need is, rather than saying quotas and you're going to be fined if you don't take more refugees, you should say create a refugee mobility fund. And for EU, this is for the Brexit people, for the problems of the UK, where it actually has gone above a serious threshold in terms of number of EU immigrants, provide a kind of EU immigrant mobility fund. But make it available to everyone. It seems to me that the way out of all of the problems is to create more solidarity, more positive instruments at the EU level that make everyone able to feel, okay, we're not the ones being overburdened. And I think this goes for Central and Eastern Europe on the refugees, just as much as it does for the British on Brexit, on EU immigrants. There was an issue. And if we want to try to combat let's call it the overreaction of the populace and populists taking advantage of that, the EU has to start doing something positive. It can't be all the negative.
Okay, the EU has to start doing something positive, John, and Vivian mentioned some things. I mean, like the migration fund, even though it seems to me that the lack of money in Brussels was not really the issue. I mean, money was sort of thrown at people in the south just to sort of be able to manage the crisis at the point.
For the refugees.
Right. So somebody has to pay for this. I mean, even Germany has voters. How can you sell this to them? So you have to do something positive. You have to sort of give more money. The South has to be brought up. And of course, and I would like to tie back also to something that Vivian said, in the way that probably this little sentence of Jean-Claude Juncker, the Commission President in Brussels, was one of the most corrosive things, because when he was asked why France could constantly flout the rules, he sort of mumbled, because they're France. And then, of course, an uproar rose, how unequal is that? How unjust is that, And so we see all those little hinges and corners where things get stuck and don't move on. So positive issues, more nationalization, renationalization at one point, and more togetherness at the other point. Do you see a path that really could lead forward through that?
Yeah, I'll try.
Please.
Of course, I'll try. But I just want to comment, sort of contextualize this, because I also think we need to ask the question, what is the European Union in this? Because a lot of times people are pointing the finger at Brussels and thinking about Brussels. But what is Brussels? It is made up of national governments. And the European Union is the political system in the world where the member states are most present. They are the ones who are most in control of the activities happening at the European Union level. So if you think about the European Union level as something entirely remote and distant, it is not. It is in the hands of the national governments. That's also why I talked about this initial point about the competence trap in this, because they are the ones who also control this. So the catch with this in accountability terms is that they are meeting themselves in the door, so to speak. They are shapeshift representatives. They can speak to in the European capacity and appeal to a European audience, and then they go back and speak to the national audience, and they can give two different spins consistently. That's how the institutions are configured. They are done so because member states were supposed to control the EU, pool sovereignty, and to some extent share it, but without giving it all away to the European Union. So that one cannot, on the one hand, lambast the European Union, and on the same time also make that or be responsible for that decision oneself. But the European Union is pretty close to this. So by dealing with this structural problem, the tying together, one of them, of course, therefore making the Commission more politically accountable, and the European Union system as a more clearly definable, accountable system will help. Because on the one hand, it will expose the European Union, but it will also mean that whatever comes from the European Union is accredited to the European Union. So, I mean, that's the structural aspect. The other aspect of the resources is a much more tricky one. I suspect that at the present, the only way one can do this is to go along the route of Wolfgang Schäuble to consolidate some kind of core. Whether this is consolidated along the Eurozone or along the Schengen are two very different issues. I come from Norway. We are inside of Schengen. Of course, we're not members, so it's a bit tricky going by the Schengen route. But some element of consolidation and solidifying this in a set of institutions which are more clearly identifiable, where there's a clearer contract between citizens and the supranational institutions, and where lines of accountability are clearer, might be one step. I mean, I know this is some people call it a pipe dream, but it is important to stabilize the European undertaking. And I think that my last point has to do with, there's a deep irony in the European Union. I think it's a very sad irony in the European Union, because this is probably one of the most enlightened and most sophisticated constitutional debate the world has ever seen. However, very few people actually appreciate and see it as that, because what we are seeing is the imagining of a continent operating together in a reasonably democratic fashion. In fact, if you think about the European Union, it's probably one of the most democratic ways of forging a political system. This is one of the profound ironies of it. But the self-perception of what this is and how it's operating is very much denied, partly because nobody really wants to be accountable for the normative vision behind it. So there have been many medicines in Europe and many debates about this. But there is still this type of what I would call polity accountability, that people need to link the solidarity principle and other practical arrangements to fundamental principles and visions of the political order. This is happening, but it's very difficult for people to connect to. So the downside of this is that the normative salience of nationalism lingers on because it's not confronted with an articulated alternative, an explicit alternative. And I think the only way to combat this type of narrow nationalism we see is to speak to an alternative. That's not to say to elevate the European Union to some kind of glorified status, but to say that the European Union is committed to be what I would call a kind of federation. You can find other terms, that's not the important point. The point is that it is transcending certain types of divisions that have marred Europe's past. And we made progress, and I was also very taken by Finance Minister Noonan's comments yesterday. The European Union still is young, so stability is important to solidify for now, but also then to give people a hope in the direction forwards is fundamentally important.
So we do hope it doesn't die in its use, like certain rock stars that we don't need to mention here. Goran, I would like you in the audience to maybe consider one or the other question. I would like to bring you in very soon. But Goran, I have a question for you. Apart from the important point that we say the European Union certainly is the most interesting and the most positive political experiment that maybe the world has ever seen, more or less, I think. But there is a basic dishonesty about its functioning, because you know what happens after European Council. As long as the doors are closed, people sit in there. Nobody really knows what they're talking, except for their closest aides, and they don't talk. So something gets put on paper, everybody comes out and says, oh, we agreed on this and that and the other. Then everybody goes home to their national capitals. And what do? They were in a totally different film. It was not the one that was played behind those closed doors. What they do is they say, oh, I had to battle them every centimeter of the road, and I managed to defy them. I managed to wring this compromise from them, and it's all the good for the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, still, that will change. The United Kingdom, Germany is sort of also a sinner, but probably not as bad because Angela Merkel is not given to theatrics. But of course, in Paris, in Rome, very much so. So two different things are always presented. The reality of Brussels, the reality of agreements behind closed doors, and this other reality that is being played out on the national stage. Can that be overcome, or do you think that is really finally so corrosive that it'll kill us in our political youth?
I mean, to use your music analogy, the rock star, you know, yes, we have the best rock star ever in the European Union, at least as long as unions are there. But when we go in the national capitals, we focus on their drug habit. So basically, all what you talk is not about how well performing they are, but you know how much of substance they've abused at the detriment of your own people. And you know, I live in Budapest, and in Budapest, Brussels is the new Moscow. Yeah, Moscow from the Cold War era. You walk on the street and you see posters which tell you, we are going to fight against the Brussels. Brussels will not be the new Moscow. We won't hear dictum. And then you're asking yourself, wait a second, Brussels is you. You know, Brussels is you. It's nobody else. It's
even
you who set
Orban
the rules.
participates in those councils. I mean, he's there. I've seen him.
He had 4 times chance to sign all the agreements. He had 4 times chance to say, no, I'm not going to sign. He signed. So, but, you know, it is a problem. It is a problem. And I pointed it actually at national level. because people experience totally different the national politics, and then Brussels through that prism. I see two actually very big worries on the horizon. One is when the mainstream parties take the radical right agenda or of the parties, and that really, really worries me. And let's get away from Hungary. Let's go in the neighboring Austria. You know, guess what happens? You have Hofer, you know, thread, and then the first thing what the mainstream parties do, oh, we are going to close the borders, we're going to be anti-immigration, we're going actually to be tougher than they are. I think that's not a road that we would like to take. And that's not a road that Europe would like to take, because actually that's a road that eventually you will have a radical right Europe just implemented by mainstream parties. And I don't think that that's a vision. My second worry is even bigger. We so much praise the values, and we really, over decades, the European continent tried to stay within, and there has been a lot of trade-offs and so on. But I find at this moment those values at absolute jeopardy. Let me give you one example, which I really, also in the work in our foundation, we can't be worried more than that. And that is about Great Britain pulling off from the European Convention on Human Rights. That is universal, that has nothing to do with European Union, that is universal, that applies to every person on the soil of Europe, of Britain. And the discussion of where it goes, it's not about sovereignty, or we can keep human rights better. It's also about actually attempts, and maybe even potentially with a great chance to be successful, to introduce first, second, and third class of citizenry, and to introduce citizens versus non-citizens at European soil. Meaning you can have a British Human Rights Act that will apply only to British citizens. And in the current environment, that's actually spectacularly wrong. I mean, that means that actually we will be at par with some of the Gulf states in the way how we treat citizens and non-citizens. And I'm not sure that these are the European values that actually most citizens will subscribe to. But unfortunately, we live in times where you mentioned media and so on. There is a profound confusion, while the erosion of these standards has already happened. Now, what to do? There are mechanisms. The very rock star that you mentioned has mechanisms. These people get together, even if it's in the lounge behind the scene. The lounge, for correction, is called EPP, for example, European People's Party. Many of the parties that I mentioned here are members of that club. And actually, they could have discussions. I don't need public, those discussions. But there are discussions there, and there could be some lines drawn on actually what gets jeopardized and what not. Where you make political compromise nationally, but where actually it's not allowed as part of the ethics, not necessarily of a firm rule. And frankly, in European Union, I think the systems have been built to have enough fora and to have enough processes to do that, and it just takes enough people to start calling it and start doing it.
Thank you, Goran, for that. I mean, mentioning the word of Viktor Orban, of an illiberal democracy that he would like to see in Europe, that pretty much sums it up. I mean, the whole trend. I would like to put the first question to you that we have received online. And it says, some analysis suggests that non-voters and supporters of populist parties have similar attitudes and priorities. Why then does a decline in political trust have a political result? And this is really, really quite a sharp question. Why do some voters trust populists, but not mainstream politicians? So it's not an erosion of trust as itself, but in whom people trust. So who would like to take this? Vivian, do you, Daniel?
I could
Please,
share
go
my
ahead.
thoughts on this. Well, I think one of the main reasons is that for many voters of this new wave of populist, often far-right parties, it's a way of basically showing their dissatisfaction with the current political elites, and a feeling of a cycle of two political families, taking turns in governing their respective country, and by selecting, those elements which are considered to be either fringe elements or those who have clearly anti-democratic, anti-system values and attitudes, they are trying to shake the political establishment. that's one of the explanations we heard, for example, in Slovakia, when for the first time we have a far-right, I would even call them extremist party in the parliament with 8% of the general votes. But I think there are other important issues at stake. You know, we are seeing the return of identity politics. The issues of economy, as it was mentioned also by Vivian, are not the only explanation we should be looking at. And at times of crisis such as this we are living in, you know, the issue of identity is becoming maybe the central for many people in Europe, and these parties are very successful in actually pushing their own idea of what the identity should look like. Unfortunately, their idea of identity is very much xenophobic and closed and building on strong nationalist sentiments. So that would be my explanation why many non-voters, but also first-time voters are voting for these populist elements.
I would like to see whether there are questions in the audience. Right here, could we have microphones to the front here, please? The lady in the first row. And may I ask you to really put very brief questions, because otherwise I need to interfere. That would be horrible.
Okay. My name is Caroline de Guiter. I live in Vienna. I'm a Dutch journalist and author, and I spent 10 years in Brussels. But I also lived in Geneva for 4 years. And it seems to me that what we're talking about here is not just a European problem. In Switzerland, you've had an extreme right-wing party, which has been the biggest since 20 years, since the mid-90s. Switzerland is one of the most globalized countries in the world. I think as much as we have a problem with Brussels, wherever we are in the European Union,
If you forgive me, but you wanted to put a question.
the Swiss have the same problem with Brussels. Look at the American elections. What kind of sentiments you see coming up there? I don't think it has anything to do with Europe, the problems that we're having now.
So what
So
was
my
the question now?
question is a remark.
Yeah, please. What is it?
No, it's a remark.
Thank
you.
Okay, do we have a question? Like, with a question mark at the end? Please, the lady in the back there. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Reen Cabralo. I run Migrants Organized in the United Kingdom. And I'm originally from Bosnia. I'm a refugee in the United Kingdom. My question is, if or when Britain leaves European Union, would European Union offer, and what do you think about this idea, European citizenship to the 48% of us who voted to remain?
That Vivian, you would like to answer that. Oh dear, Vivian is being so generous today.
Right. Yeah, I'd actually like to answer this question as well as that. I guess the question is, what is Switzerland, but what is also Trump, Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders, Orban, etc., have in common? And it is about a reaction to globalization and a feeling of loss of control. I argued before it's about hyper-globalization and hyper-Europeanization. I think people in the EU feel it more strongly, but it is a more generalized problem. I think there are two issues here. One is about the economics. One, it's about neoliberalism. It's about an economic philosophy that is also a political philosophy that essentially pushes the market before the state. And I think what you're seeing is people are saying, wait a minute, you know, what's the role of the state? And there we've seen a hollowing out of the state, largely because it's what Jan Erik talked about in terms of the rise of technocracy, decisions going off to experts of various kinds in autonomous, non-majoritarian bodies. And then the question is, do they work? Because one kind of legitimacy is about performance. If you have good performance, then people don't ask questions about, is it legitimate? Well, the performance has not been very good ever since the economic crisis. But even before that, we've had the rise of the extremes, which suggests it's not just about the economics. It's also about, it's not just performance, it is about the politics, it's also about the processes. It's about questions of transparency, accountability, et cetera.
Bologna.
And yeah, and there are serious problems there too. And then finally, for Brexit, if I can, I think it's not really just a question of citizenship, and I'm happy to grant everyone, but it is not just about how the UK deals with Brexit, but how does the EU deal with the UK dealing with Brexit? And here I think the EU needs to have a leap forward in terms of how it thinks about itself. Unlike Jan, Eric, I'm not in favor of thinking about the future of the EU as a hardcore Europe around one single policy area, whether it is the euro or Schengen, and it's more likely the euro one, it won't work. I can't see France and Germany agreeing on a set of rules for the euro unless they're German rules, which the French won't like. I think what you need to do is think about the EU is made up of a whole large number of different policy communities, Schengen, security, as well as the euro, et cetera, energy, and think about different clusters of member states being members of these different policy communities. So it's the overlap of membership that creates a soft core of membership. That is what the EU is, with one set of institutions where everyone is in there and has voice, but only those who vote in the particular policy communities of which they're a part. The truth is, this is already what the EU is, but no one thinks about it that
Brussels
way.
speak to say more enhanced cooperation on all sorts of fronts. But I would like to give a question right here in the middle, to the front, please. And the next one then over on the other side. Thank you very much. Thanks.
It's Josef Vatra, professor of political science at Comenius University. Now, I actually don't think there's much of a tension between the two positions, between Vivian and John Eric's position, because it seems like Vivian is describing clusters, what we have right now, and John Eric is calling for a vision, a move forward from there towards something else. So my question then goes to Jon Erik, and that is, what exactly would be the foundation of this new citizen compact, the new contract with the citizens in the new integrative, well, quasi-federation, if we wanted to move there? What exactly would you found that on?
Thank you very much. Let me take just a further question back over on that side.
Thanks a lot. Federico Taviero from the Martin Center, that is the think tank of the European People's Party. I would like to make two short comments, if you allow me. First of all, since the EPP was mentioned several times yesterday and today, let me say that you may not observe public discussions on these topics, but I can tell you that behind the scene, closed doors meetings, there is a lot of moral suasion going on, and I can assure you that this is the best way at this stage to deal with this kind of issues. And if you have seen a readiness in the Orban's position to backtrap and to compromise much more than the other enfant terrible, you know, that is Kaczynski, I think a great deal of this is also due to behind-the-scene moral suasion
if you allow me to create a question from this, so because I saw Goran sort of move a little bit, is it good enough? Is it good enough that these things are being talked about behind closed doors? But just keep this on hold for a second, because we have also received another question via our app, which I would like to add.
I have actually a second question, if I may. No, I may not.
Enough. Thank you. Let me move on, please. We often hear the soundbite that the EU should do less. Now, we've heard this already too. But what does it mean in practice? What policy area in which the EU is currently active should it not longer be active in? Please name one. Now, that's what I call a concrete question. All right. So who wants to go first, please? Goran, you had already sort of wiggled.
Okay, I'll drop a bomb here. Agricultural policy, for example, to start with, you know, that it's so much money of the European Union budget, agricultural policy, it goes to a negligible % of population in Europe. So if you are a precarious worker of a factory that has been closed in Birmingham or somewhere else, you know, you will see why these people spend 40+% of the budget on a field which actually doesn't make sense to most of us. That's one area. The second area is actually, I think we really have to go and rethink the social contracts. And you really spoke about that in length, both at the level of institutions, but also at the level of individuals. I talked about that report earlier on. 50% of the jobs that have been created in OECD, including European Union, are so-called non-permanent jobs. Or if you want, in a more leftist literature, they're precarious jobs, meaning that somebody has to have 1-2 jobs just to meet ends. It doesn't have a profession, as the blue-collar workers had. It doesn't have a status. So actually, you have to think about the individual social contract. And my last point is about one thing we often confuse is trust and trustworthiness in the institutions. I think it's about the trustworthiness in the institutions. Why individuals should trust those institutions is because they have to be trustworthy. Now, if you have government, today in Europe, corruption is not about bribe. Corruption is about how you redistribute the funds, including the EU funds. And if the redistribution is seen as corrupted, then you don't have trustworthy institutions. And I think a lot of, not only negotiation, a lot of real tangible results have to be shown. And on tangible results, that's actually what I expect from EPP. The tangible results, I really think your discussion should be behind, and they should remain that way. But the tangible results should be something which is, concrete message towards policies that jeopardize European values. What is the standpoint of EPP on not having a constitutional court? What is the standpoint of EPP of not having free media? These are all fundamental elements of the democracy that we claim EU is based on. And I'm not saying that they should turn into a master to the pupil. I would dislike that. Hungarians are equal partners, and they should be equal partners. But these are tough questions, and sometimes unpopular decisions, unpopular statements have to be made and maintained. And I think that's what populist politicians of the day are afraid, to make unpopular statements and then stay with them.
Goran, I think that was probably the bombshell of this whole discussion, was to abolish GAP. Are there any Frenchmen in the audience? No. Are we lucky?
No.
Are we lucky? But I think this is really very interesting. So I would like to sort of stay there just one little moment, if I might ask you to sort of just answer this briefly. What would you drop from the whole menu of European policies? Daniel, please.
Actually, I would rather reformulate the question. It's not about what the EU should do less, but it's rather what EU should be doing more, and what are the other areas where we see a very dire lack of activity or lack of coordination. If I just go back to the first panel we had this morning, the idea of more coordinated efforts in the area of security, of sharing information, but overall in the area of homeland security or internal security is of such paramount importance that, now thinking of how to scale back the EU activities and the coordinated efforts, I think it's a completely wrong attitude. We are really in times of crisis when what in my perspective we need more is more coherent and more complex efforts at addressing these issues, because at national level there is only so much we can achieve. Of course, we are speaking of a lack of credibility, lack of legitimacy, and this has to be addressed. But if we really want to contemplate of which areas should be left out of the whole spectrum, well, I'm rather a Euro optimist, and I would definitely support those who think that despite this, the Brexit, which somehow opened the Pandora's box for many of these fringe elements, and it seems that the spell of the EU is somehow broken, I would rather stick to going further and to see more cooperation and more integration in those areas which are now currently at the national level.
This is the rare animal, the Euro-optimist. Give him a round of applause, maybe. Thank you very much. And we have further questions on that side, please. Yes?
You wanted a Frenchman. I'm a French woman. So, from Sciences Po Paris. And
Oh dear. Now we're in hot water.
okay. No, my comment and question actually in dialogue with Viviane. And Front National is a not new phenomenon. From father to daughter, they have been around since the 1980s. Themes change, but it's always around identity politics. Maybe what EU brought is much more the discussion on sovereignty and the loss of sovereignty that brought identity politics at the core of all politics. Whatever the Le Pen family said, it has become a ground for all politics competition in France. But now my question is European Union, like nation states, member states, are not going through, no. Does European Union is not going through an existential crisis as facing globalization, of course, and one aspect of the globalization being the transnational solidarity, migration, refugees, and even put terrorism in it. And although European Union, to begin with, is a transnational space without solidarity. So the question of solidarity and trust, is it a cause or a consequence of this issue, of this existential crisis?
That sounds like a question for Viviane, really.
Yeah, it's both a cause and a consequence. I think there's a tremendous problem. But when we talk about Marine Le Pen, she's been actually very clever, and I think this is the problem combating populism today. It was in some ways easier to sort of to say, oh, Papa Le Pen, you know, he's an anti-Semite, he's beyond the pale, he says things that no one should say. Marine Le Pen has been very clever about expunging from the Front National those elements that would say these things, regardless of whether they think them. And she has a kind of coded language, and lots of the populists do, that can appeal to the extremes at the same time that she appears more banal, as people have said. So I think this is, I mean, that's the challenge of populism is actually for mainstream politicians to find ways to actually talk about trust and solidarity and sovereignty in ways that work within the EU. And I think it's both things have to happen. You need change at the EU level as well as the national level. And as others have said, of course, the EU is its member states. And this is what's so crazy about the discussion. So everyone blames Brussels. But, you know, this is a kind of blame game that has been tremendously destructive to the EU. So how do you go forward with this? One is in terms of language. It is trying, and ideas, trying to find a new way forward. And I think that really means rethinking basic ideas. It means rethinking the kinds of neoliberal or ordoliberal policies, if we want to talk about the Eurozone, that we've had before. It is also about, you know, you can't continue to have part-time contracts or high levels of unemployed and say that's normal. You are necessarily feeding extremism. And if we have to pick extremes, give me the left rather than the right. Because the left at least continues to talk about human rights and has tended to be more pro-EU. I mean, we're stuck, however, with an extreme right that is terribly dangerous. And part of the problem is it's dangerous in different ways in different countries.
So
and
Viviane,
each
if
country,
you will forgive me, we only have a few minutes left, and I hate to do this, but I would like to take maybe 2 or 3 questions, very brief questions only at this point in time, and I'm afraid very brief answers. Thank you very much. Okay, we have one here in the middle, the young lady, and then one on that side. Thank you.
Thank you. Ruslan Zabahidze, representing Europe-Georgia Institute. Speaking of the areas where you should do more, I think education is one more area. And as we all agreed on the importance of educating citizens, as a beneficiary of Erasmus Plus exchange program, I think there is much more to do in this direction. As a professor, for example, what programs or reforms would you suggest in order to actually, for example, tell more to EU citizens about the third partner countries? So, for example, coming from Georgia, I don't have to argue whether Georgia is an European state or not. Sometimes it's not about
please?
I mean, what reforms would you suggest in educational field in order to increase the awareness of EU citizens?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Reforms to education. Okay, another one on that side, please. Yes.
Thanks. Helen Derbyshire from Access Info Europe. Goran, starting with you, for me the bombshell wasn't the Common Agricultural Policy, it was, if I heard you right, that you seem to blame civil society for failing to build European citizenry. My question is to do with what we actually need to do to build European citizenry. Barbara, you talked about the policy laundering going through the European Union. We have a huge difficulty in getting information about what's actually happening in Brussels. We've got cases ongoing right now about information about refugees, lobbying, trade deals, infringement proceedings, and so forth. So how can we, as civil society, hope to build European citizenry when we can't get the information that we need to participate?
Okay.
Thank you.
Lack of information. And just one more question. Like here in the middle, please. If you could reach the microphones through to the gentleman in the middle, we'd all be happy. You'll be very brief.
Okay, I'm going to be very brief. Thank you. Carlos Bukovskis from the Latvian Institute for National Affairs. I have a brief provocation, actually. I was listening. You all have excellent recommendations, and the questions also included quite a lot of recommendations. But my question mainly is, and it's very much related to the very topic of this panel and the conference itself, to whom do these recommendations go to? It's not only this conference, it's every conference, it's all that we are all doing and writing and researching and thinking about. The question is that Juncker? Are those national politicians? Who are the ones who are responsible? Whom should be citizens asking these things to be implemented?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, let's start with education. I think, John, that was directly going for you. Professors are supposed to know what needs to be done to make things better in that regard. Please, very briefly, because time is running.
Yeah, the European Union has already got some programs in place, and I hope they can extend those to also cover applicant countries. And you know, the broader issue here is also to rewrite the very history of Europe, as you have seen in some kind of collaborative projects, that is no longer purely national. I mean, I've looked at the textbooks in Norway, and in geography there was a book, an assignment to students to plan a trip to Europe. I mean, we are part of Europe. So writing in the Europe dimension itself, from the very early stages, in people will make that type of awareness much higher. And then, of course, the European Union could have a specific obligation also to do this, and also to facilitate the exchanges, which are so important at all the different types of levels, is fundamental. So, but I think that education is fundamental to the very sustenance of democracy. So the other pitch is to institute civic education in all the levels. And I think then a lot of this information would come because people would be sensitized to human rights and other kinds of issues.
Yeah, the Brits famously always talk about the continent when they talk about us here. We are the continent. Goran, how to build the citizen? Please defend yourself and explain. You have about 3 sentences, which is easier.
First, I think the education is not the solution. I have nothing against education. I think listening is. All these people who are vocal, actually what they ask is to be listened to. And this is what radical right is doing. They're listening to what they're asking. They may ask the wrong questions, but they're listening. And I think mainstream political parties, civil society organizations are not doing enough of listening. So education will come next. Once when you're accepted in the pub, you drink that pint of beer, you know, you've listened enough, then you will get your right to ask the question. I think that it's a fundamental change of what we will say from top down into bottom up in language that very few people understand. Civil society. I do think civil society has done a lot, and civil society has done a lot in the domain of expertise. I think they've brought a fantastic expertise and opening of those institutions. But where actually civil society in many different places has failed is to build a constituency. So to have a population that then will understand and then back up that expertise and done. And this is actually, if we learn, there is part of civil society that will turn a blind eye. It's the right-wing civil society, super effective in Poland, very effective in Hungary. They do actually a meaningful job, a lot of them. Not everything is bad. One characteristic is that actually they have a lot of following. I think the progressive civil society thought that with the power of ideas, they will actually get attraction. I think we have to get some of the power of numbers, especially if they live and operate in populist countries where this is the only thing what matters. And then the last thing is who should do that? I mentioned about civil society. I think political parties, you know, many of them are dying out. If this is not a call for them to start thinking, how do I reinvent myself? Do I reinvent myself with membership? Do I reinvent myself with innovation? Do I reinvent myself with a protest? I don't know when they will be called. I mean, look at the number of political parties that suffered severe defeats and decline. Businesses, you know, I would offer to the CEO of Citibank a 0 hours contract. And see how he would react to that. I mean, because don't get me wrong. I mean, you know, often we say these things, and then how is to live with a 0 hour contract? Can you be a CEO of Citibank with a 0 hour contract? Now, can you be a bartender with a 0 hour contract? There are a lot of things, and businesses so far have opted to play behind, to be on the sidelines, and hoping that they will find an agency through a political party and solve their problems later. I think they should be bringing in right now. Actually, it's already too late. So I hope I address your questions.
Thank you, Goran. We have two more answers, brief answers, one from Daniel, and then the last word goes to Vivian. Daniel,
a brief
please.
one, how to build European citizenry. Well, since I grew up in Slovakia, which had to go through a huge and sometimes very difficult transformation process, which involved economic hardships, the one thing which actually helped my country, but also all the post-communist countries to went through this process, was this vision. The vision of being members of the EU, having a kind of credible, positive vision. And this is something which I very much lack in today's discussion. As you also mentioned, Barbara, all this talk of crises and, you know, many different crises attacking the EU at the same time. What kind of positive and credible vision do we have for young generation? So if we are not able to produce such a vision and to back it with policy measures, then what should we expect? Why the people shouldn't be turning their backs on the political establishment?
Vivian, you already talked about positive measures earlier in our discussions that need to be taken. So this must be right out of your book. Take positive measures, develop a positive vision to regain the trust of the people, and then the next step is out of that will grow wonderful European citizens, hopefully, one day.
Yeah, absolutely. So to paraphrase a current presidential candidate, it takes a village. This is Hillary Clinton. It takes a village, but it takes cities, regions, nations, and Europe. I mean, it seems to me that you need a revival, a rethinking from the bottom up. But to bring in citizens, and it's still about the economics. It's about the ideas. It's about policies. You need policies that work. And you need, I think the final word is social solidarity. We've had a lot of so-called economic solidarity, which has really resulted in kind of punishment. But now you need real social solidarity. You need everyone to recognize the EU is interdependent and everyone depends on everyone else. So there needs to be more redistribution across the EU, different kinds of ways to do this. I suggested various kinds of funds, but you probably need EU-wide unemployment insurance that actually works. You probably need, I hate to say this, but for those of you who don't like it, Eurobonds. You need to use, instead of quantitative easing, use Eurobonds, mutualize the debt, do a whole range of things that would make the Eurozone actually work.
So that was the vision from Vivian. Thank you very much. That I, as a German, sort of shrink a bit, but we will talk about that maybe next time, more in depth. I thank you very much for this panel. I would like you to give them a round of applause because it has been fascinating. And we've heard about the future. That is the future for all of us because we're all in it together. Now that was a slogan that David Cameron maybe abused, but for us, I think here in Europe, it is certainly true. So may I ask you to please stay in your seats now because we're not quite finished yet. Because the next speaker and the last speaker of today will be the president of GLOBSEC, Robert Wasch, and he will tie the ties and close the lid on 3 very interesting, exciting days. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this excellent panel. Dear friends, after 4 days of excellent debates here in this room, but not only in this room, also on many bilateral meetings on the sidelines, I think I feel a huge satisfaction. Not only we have been able to gather you, so many important people in Bratislava during this weekend, during the 4 days, but the debates that I've heard here were absolutely substantial. They brought new ideas and new answers, and that's what we need for the future of Europe. But the fact that this room is full on Sunday afternoon is a convincing evidence that you all care about Europe and you are ready to sacrifice your free Sunday for fixing its future. And I think that's a good message for all of us and for Europe. You certainly make a difference. Over the weekend, Bratislava, and especially this hotel, was the center of Europe. There were tweets, Facebook posts, articles, reports, broadcasts, reaching far places outside of this hotel. Let me share with you some of the statistics about this conference. During these 4 days, we have welcomed more than 1,300 participants from over 50 countries. We had 150 speakers in 30 panels together. I think it's quite a lot. And 40% of all the participants were women. I think, and that's quite of an achievement, and I think it's better than in Davos or Munich. We hold over 120 side meetings, policy sessions, and bilateral meetings, so not only what was here in this room was important, but all the networking going on in the multiple conference rooms and meeting rooms, they make a real difference. We welcomed 125 journalists that were covering this conference. The Facebook reach was over 44,000 people and with over 12,000 engagements. And the Twitter is even more interesting. 160,000 tweet impressions and with the exposure to more than 7 million people. And this would not be possible without the great work done by the GLOBSEC team, our partners, our friends that have been helping us and supporting for months and months of the work to prepare this conference. Let me mention a few names. First of all, one of our founders and probably the most busiest person during the Slovak EU presidency, Mr. Europe here in Slovakia, State Secretary Ivan Korčok, who has been helping us tremendously to make this happen. Without his help, his dedication, and his time, it would be impossible to organize this conference. Ivan, a huge, huge thanks for your dedication to the second summit during the presidency in Bratislava. Thank you very much. Well, it's over for us. You have 6 more weeks to go. Good luck with that. Another person who has helped us a lot is Mr. Vasil Hudak, who has just become the Vice President of the European Investment Bank. He is the former Minister of Economy. And he helped us to put together the key people and visionaries from private and public sector in the investment forum. Without his help, it would be impossible. He is not here, but probably he sees that somewhere on internet, so I think he deserves an applause as well from us. And I want to mention also my dear friend and the closest cooperator, who besides of his official duties in Slovak diplomacy always finds time to give us the right wisdom, the right guidance, and the right advice to go in the right path. Rasto, thank you for your dedication. Ambassador Rastislav Káčer. But probably the biggest burden laid on the shoulders of my colleagues. The smooth functioning of the conference was due to the quiet but hard and excellent, I have to say, work behind the shades. And I want to mention a few names. First of all, Martina Ola and Milan Solar, who has been steering the TATRA summit team of more than 120 team members and interns for months and months of very hard work. Please join me in thanking them for the excellent work you have done. And I want to mention also Lucia Milanova, my very close colleague, because she had a especially difficult job, as we don't have secured funding for this, and we need to run with our partners to look for sponsors and money to have this conference here in Bratislava. Her team needed to handle more than 30 partners, and I know it is not easy many times. So Lucia, thank you for your leadership, and thank you for everything you've done with your team to make this happen. And thanks for all the sponsors who have helped us. I want to say 3 things before I finish, I promise. And they have to do with 3 words: inspiration, perspiration, and aspiration. Also, first, inspiration. I think we all have been very inspired by the ideas and plans that how to fix our common problems, be them about security, terrorism, single market, banking union, and that's very important. Second, aspiration. My organization, GLOBSEC, has an ambition to secure impact, so that the foreign policy choices are translated into more stable and free international environment. We want to be relevant, but we cannot do it on ourselves. We can do it only with you. And there comes the persistence, because we know that all these 4 days, 4 busy days, panels, discussions, brainstormings, and networking, were very good, but we all know that all that work does not start and finish at the conference. If we want the European project to survive, the EU reform will require constant attention of all of us, beyond this room, be it in Berlin, Brussels, or Bratislava. So I would like to invite you to work together for a better Europe. And with that, I would like to thank all of you who have participated in these 4 days in Bratislava at this conference. And I want to invite you for a glass of wine and lunch as the last item in our agenda today. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the Sunday, and see you hopefully in our next conference, which will be in Bratislava, and that is in May, GLOBSEC 2017. Thank you very much once again. Thank you.